Hello everyone. We're going to start the session in about 30 seconds time. We're just waiting for everybody to join.
Sorry, Joe. It's not started yet, sorry.
All right. Just give us just say go or count me in.
Webinar is now live.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. We're just waiting for everybody to join, so we'll start in just a few moments' time. Okay, I think it's time to get started now. So hello everyone and welcome to this session today on how to fix the holes in automatic enrolment. For those who don't know me, I'm Jo Cumbo, the Global Pensions Correspondent with the Financial Times. And it's great to be with you here today at your conference for this discussion on a very important policy, and that is automatic enrolment. Now, most of you are going to be familiar with the nuts and bolts of automatic enrolment, so I don't propose going through those. But one thing that is widely agreed about automatic enrolment is that it's regarded as one of the biggest policy successes this country has seen in many years. Prior to the rollout of automatic enrolment in 2012, there were just 900,000 active members of workplace DC schemes. Following the introduction of auto-enrolment in 2012, those numbers shot up to 10.6 million just 7 years later in 2019. However, not everything is as it appears on the surface, because not everyone is well served by automatic enrolment, and that is the focus of today's discussion. So who are the workers who are being left behind by automatic enrolment, and what are the best ways of making the pension system work better for all groups of workers? Now, I'm very pleased to be introducing to you an excellent panel of speakers here today to tackle these questions. I'm going to get to them and introduce them to you very shortly. But firstly, the format for today's session, it'll start with a short presentation from each of our three speakers today, after which there will be questions from you. Now, if you'd like to ask a question or make a point, you can do so at any time during the session, and I have been asked to remind you about the code of conduct, which is also in the Q&A box, if you could just read that first. The chat box is also open for you to share comments or information during the session. Now, if you want to post a question for any of the panelists, you can do so at any time in the Q&A box. You don't have to wait until the end. But if you want your points addressed by the panelists, make sure they are in the Q&A box and not in the chat. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our excellent panel of speakers today. Firstly, a name that will be familiar to many of you, and that's Chris Curry, who is Director of the Pensions Policy Institute. In addition, Chris has a part-time role as Principal of the Pensions Dashboard Program, which is aiming to get the dashboard off the ground in a few years' time, and that is with the Money and Pension Service. Now, Chris was also one of three co-chairs of the 2017 DWP Automatic Enrolment Review. Next, we have Joe Anderton, who is Pensions Research Officer with Prospect. Now, Joe has worked in pensions since 2008, having joined Prospect in 2019. Now, before that, he was a pensions manager at the University of Hertfordshire. And last but not least is Cara Pacitti, who is an economist with the Resolution Foundation, whose work focuses on macroeconomics and housing. Now, Cara recently co-authored a report published by the foundation on building a living pension, and we're going to hear more about that today. Now, I think that's all the introductions over. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Chris to get the event started. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Joe. Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today for a very important topic. I think, as Joe has already mentioned, one of the things I've been lucky enough to do during my time working in the pensions sphere, which has probably been too long for many people. I think if you've got very long memories, we're now, the Pensions Policy Institute is this year celebrating its 20th anniversary. We've been looking at pensions for a long time. And I think, as Joe mentioned, automatic enrolment has been one of the, if not the major pensions policy success in that period of time. I was lucky enough to be part of the 2017 automatic enrolment review, which was very much aimed at trying to identify the holes in automatic enrolment and do something about fixing it. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes hopefully introducing you or updating you on the subject and bringing you up to date with the recommendations and findings of that review, and then setting the scene for Joe and Cara to follow on behind afterwards. So if we could move on to the first slide, please. As we've already heard, automatic enrolment has created a really good foundation for workplace pension saving, and the increase in the number of people saving for their retirement through workplace pensions has been phenomenal. I think, as Joe's already said, from less than 1 million before automatic enrolment was introduced to over 10 million individuals in workplace DC by 2019. So on the face of it, in looking at in terms of the numbers of people saving for their retirement, automatic enrolment has been incredibly successful. But it's also worth bearing in mind that automatic enrolment is still relatively new and has only really just ended the first stage of implementation. So although it started in 2012, it didn't reach all employers until much later than that. I think towards 2015, 2016, and then the contribution levels weren't increased to the current minimum levels until 2019. So it's taken a long time to get to what can be seen as the first part of automatic enrolment. And so it's really important that we look at how well automatic enrolment is working at the moment and where it might go next. Because the two issues that the review identified back in 2017 was that there are still issues about who is saving. And so although we've seen this big increase in the number of people saving for retirement, we still haven't reached everybody in the workplace saving for their retirement, or everyone in the workplace who we think should be saving for their retirement still saving. And we'll come on to some of those groups who are missed out in automatic enrolment as part of that. And then the part that I was responsible for as one of the co-chairs, which is the adequacy of saving, or how much is contributed, how much is saved over a lifetime by individuals throughout automatic enrolment. I should mention here that the two other co-chairs, Jamie Jenkins and Ruston Smith, also I think performed an amazing job with the team at the DWP on the review. And one of the things that all three of us were very clear about when we were starting the review and proceeding through 2017 is that it's really important that we don't look at automatic enrolment just in isolation. So although it's been a really successful program and it's brilliant in what it's achieved so far, actually, given everything else that's been happening in the pensions and retirement space, even considering pension saving as the sole source of income and wealth in retirement, is probably something that we've moved on from. And so when we think about coverage and adequacy of saving through automatic enrolment, it's not just assuming that this pension is all that individuals will have in retirement. You need to look at it alongside, for example, the role of the state pension, but also other forms of saving and other forms of income that people might have when they get into retirement. Excuse me. Now, as well as looking at the different sources of income that people might have, it's also important to think about what needs individuals might have from automatic enrolment. And by this, I mean there are different groups with potentially different income levels who might need different things from automatic enrolment. So for some who have low income throughout their working life, they may only need a small amount of income from automatic enrolment to top up their state pension. Others who potentially have larger income throughout and for whom the state pension is less important may then need to have more income coming from automatic enrolment in retirement. And I think it's very clear that when you're thinking about who is covered by automatic enrolment and how much the minimum should be, that it's very much not a one size fits all, and we need to look at what you can build on top of that. And that's why looking at engagement on top of automatic enrolment was also a very important part of the 2017 review. If we can move on to the next slide, which just covers some of the recommendations. It's very important, I think, to bear in mind that these recommendations were made in 2017, and that at that stage, there still hadn't been the full implementation of all of the income increases in the minimum contributions. And so we weren't expecting these recommendations to be enacted until probably the middle of the 2020s. And part of that was so that we could see what the response was to those final increases in contributions, and to work out if they were affecting the way that individuals were responding within automatic enrolment. I think it's clear that there wasn't much of a change in behaviour as a result of the increase in contributions. And so I think these review recommendations are still just as pertinent now as they were at the time that they were made. So there were recommendations around increasing the contribution, so making automatic enrolment available to younger individuals, so starting the age of automatic enrolment at 18 as opposed to 22 as it currently is, and a really important element about making pension saving count from the first £1 of contributions that individuals have. And so by doing that, by removing the lower earnings threshold gradually over time. And so that also has the impact of actually making the contribution rate, the minimum contribution of 8%, of actually being 8% of earnings. At the moment, it's only taken on income above that lower threshold. And so most people are contributing less than 8% of their earnings if they're at the minimum level. There was no recommendation to change the earnings threshold to the point at which, or the earnings level above which individuals are automatically enrolled, but it should be monitored over time. Because it's very important that as working patterns change, and as, for example, as we've seen increases in self-employment and part-time working, the system adapts with it to make sure that individuals who perhaps have multiple jobs can also benefit from the employer contribution of automatic enrolment. So the self-employed are currently outside of automatic enrolment, and so it was recommended that there should be some trial solutions for how to increase saving amongst the self-employed. I think it's important to recognise that they can't be automatically enrolled in the same way as employees are, because there is no employer to fulfil that function. But again, the amount of savings that they have is very important. And also recommendations to look further at how some of those people who need to do more than just the minimum in automatic enrolment can be helped to do that. There's been lots of progress around issues such as simpler annual statements. As Joe's mentioned, I've got a very firm interest in pensions dashboards as well, but also in other solutions which may not be implemented across the whole country or economy, but could be encouraged amongst other employers. For example, automatic escalation is another potential option. And if we can just move on to the final slide. One of the things that the report did, and also we've been doing at work with the Pensions Policy Institute, is identify which particular groups of women may be more or less at risk from not benefiting from automatic enrolment. Sorry, which groups may be more or less at risk. Obviously, there is a really clear group which is women, partly based on their labour market entitlement. And also, as I mentioned, the self-employed. I'm not going to say too much more about those because I know that Joe and Cara will cover these groups further on. But there are other groups who are potentially less well known, people with disabilities. And again, they face the same labour market issues. And because automatic enrolment is a very closely linked and a reflection of people's labour market history, it means that the individuals who do less well in the labour market tend to do less well from automatic enrolment. People with disabilities also have another potential issue, in that they may have higher additional costs either when they're working, which makes it difficult to make contributions, or when they're in retirement, which means they need a higher retirement income. So it's really important that we look at how the system works for people with disabilities, as well as some of the other at-risk groups. And another potential group are people from Black and minority ethnic communities. Now, it's important to say that this is not a single homogenous group, and there are groups within these communities. Some who do very well in the labour market, but some who do less well in the labour market. And again, because they're more likely to suffer from having low or no earnings, being more in part-time work or more self-employed, they are less likely to qualify for automatic enrolment. That's a very quick introduction and overview. I know that there are plenty more questions and plenty of other areas to cover, but now I'll hand back to Joe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that great kicking us off there in that great fashion. Just to remind everyone that the Q&A function in the chat box are also open. If you feel you want to express any points or comments, do so during our discussion. I'd like to invite Joe to start now. Thanks, Joe.
No problem. Thanks, Joe. Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things that Chris has introduced really well. So the self-employed and women, and that's the section I'm going to focus on, starting with the self-employed. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the report that was published relatively recently, last month. Now, this is an inquiry that was led from by Prospect in conjunction with Community and the Federation of Small Businesses. Now, the report is an inquiry into the future of self-employment, and so is a wide, the focus is not on pensions, it's wider about the different types of self-employment, how that can work going forward and how it's been affected by COVID. But there are mentions of pensions, and I think it's important ones that they highlight. So I'm just going to have a look through some of these. So in order to better understand the issues affecting the self-employed and freelance workers, what the inquiry did was ran a detailed survey of self-employed workers and freelance workers between September and November 2020. Now, we try to publicise this as wide as possible, so through Prospect, Community, as well as Martin Lewis. So we've got in total 2,247 responses, which is fantastic for any sort of survey. And 39% of those were trade union members. And so kind of sharing that just to give an idea as to the kind of the people who we got responses from. So now just to outline the kind of the brief issue here. So self-employed workers make up a really important and vital part of the UK economy. And prior to COVID, there were approximately 5 million self-employed people in the UK, which is about 15% of all those in work. Now, between January and March 2020, and then June and August 2020, the numbers fell significantly, and a lot of the reasons for that I won't get into now, but are set out in the report. Now, although it's fell, we expect that to grow, and self-employed people to be a big part of the kind of build back better post-COVID world. And so, absolutely, a vital part of our economy. Now, unfortunately, the proportion of self-employed people saving a pension is at record low levels, and there's no easy solution to solving pensions for the self-employed. But what is clear is that the current system just isn't working. So we think part of the problem is the very nature of self-employed people means that they don't have that financial stability of employed workers. And so there is a reluctance to lock money into a pension that they may need as kind of time goes by in their career. But also kind of finally, pensions are incentivized for employees. Now, you've got an employer contribution, which is a huge incentive, and also auto-enrolment, which is kind of like it's not quite compulsion, but with the way people, their reaction to pensions is, a lot of the people put in never end up opting out, which is a great thing. So I've just pulled this slide out because what we've got here is that this actually came about as part of the work that I do on the gender pension gap, which I'm going to talk through next. But I just think it was a really important slide, so I've just kind of picked it up because it shows that pension scheme participation under by eligibility under the automatic rules. So what we're looking at here is the orange line is eligible employees, the blue line is non-eligible, and you can see the stark difference between that, and we've got the percentage of people who are eligible and in a scheme are over 80%. The non-eligible is very low, we're kind of talking just about 30%. But then look at the self-employed line, even lower than that. You're looking around 15% of workers in a pension scheme, and that number's dropping. And so that is kind of a stark warning about the level of savings that self-employed have. So as the survey kind of, as I said, it was a survey and there's lots of results from it, and I'd encourage anyone to have a look at the report. But what I've just picked out here is just a couple of items really that I think are important. So 75% of respondents did not believe self-employed and freelance workers have sufficient rights in the workplace compared to regular employees. And that isn't particularly surprising, I don't think. But what I did like from this was the right-hand side, you'll see this kind of priorities, you know, asking the freelancers and self-employed, well, what is the priority for you if you were to improve rights? And pensions is 26%. Now, I was quite encouraged by that because quite often I've had it leveled at me when talking about self-employed and pensions that self-employed people just aren't interested in saving for a pension. But I think what this shows is there's absolutely interest in saving towards a pension. It's just that the incentives and the system isn't there to support them in doing so. Okay, so trying to come up with some positive solutions about how this could work. Now, I think self-employed is a really tricky issue. And there isn't one clear way to solve this, and there's different types of self-employment and all have different needs. But I think overall the government should need to do a review of the incentives provided to get people, self-employed workers, saving for a pension. Now, one, I think, really good idea is to pilot some sort of government-backed sidecar scheme so people in self-employment can have a slightly more flexible access to a pension. And then communications, I think, is key. I think we've seen with auto-enrolment and the level of communication that was gone out about that, it really does make a difference. And if you can tell people what the incentives are for paying into a pension, whether that's purely financial or overall well-being, then absolutely that can make a difference. And overall, you know, the final point that just says the government should conduct a review, examine a range of solutions, acknowledging that it's complex, get a wide range of opinions, and just essentially try something. I think for too long, it's been put in the too hard to solve box, essentially. Okay, so now I've kind of going to move on to talking about the gender pension gap. Now, Prospect have been campaigning on the gender pension gap for quite a long time, a number of years, and we produce an annual report on the gender pension gap, just flagging up there. I'd kind of encourage everyone to go and have a read of that. I'm going to try and sum it up in the next kind of 3 minutes, but it's a quite a long document, so please, got the link there. If everyone wants to have a look, please do so. So I think it's important to say what our estimate of the gender pension gap is, because there's a lot of different ways you can define it. But we simply look at the percentage difference in average gross pension income for women receiving the state pension compared to the average gross pension income for men receiving the state pension. And we base this on data from the Family Resources Survey, so it's a national statistic, and we think it's a really robust estimate of the gender pension gap, because over 19,000 households are surveyed, so it's a big sample group. In terms of what the gender pension gap is, now I think this is quite shocking. Some of you may have already seen the figures on this. I know recently, because of International Women's Day, it's had a really good amount of press coverage. Now, the gender pension gap for 18-19, which is the last estimate we've done, is 40.3%. That's twice the level of the gender pay gap. And in terms of pounds and pence, that equates to about £7,500 a year difference. Now, I put below the little chart, little table, sorry, that just kind of explains a bit of the history about where it's been and where it's going. And unfortunately, it's going in the wrong direction at the moment. So we did see some positive signs from 14-15 through to 16-17, where it was a reduction, but now that is going back up. So our research, the last report we did last year was focused on pension participation and savings levels to see how that affects the gender pension gap. So we analysed the UK pension system, kind of see where it's fit for purpose, and we put some proposals together for how to solve the gender pension gap and to narrow it. So our findings, just kind of a few highlights. There's a lot in the report. This one's always interesting, and it helps us get some press coverage and highlight the issue, because the differences between the nations in the UK. Part of it is due to sampling and where people are in the country who are actually surveying in the UK. But in England and Wales, it's highest quite starkly compared to Scotland and Ireland, where it's, you know, quite markedly lower. Now, I think this is kind of a really key point. We're looking at the differences in contributions by gender. And so what the chart here is showing, we kind of decide to look at how many people would we define as saving at a good level. And as a good level, we put 6% of employee contributions, because looking at, say, historic DB schemes, that's kind of a standard kind of contribution level. Now, for men and women eligible employees, there isn't a huge difference between once they're eligible, men and women participate relatively equally in a scheme, and then once they're in a scheme, they contribute at approximately the same levels. As you can see, slightly lower for women. The biggest issue, though, is for the part-timers. As you can see, the proportion of people paying at a decent level is very low. Now, actually, it's more women paying at a better level than men, but that doesn't really tell the story, because there's approximately 770,000 men work part-time compared to 3.2 million women. And so you've got all that cohort of women not paying anywhere near enough into their pension, and it will be a significant contributor to the gender pension gap. So finally, I just want to got 2 more slides to go through. So a few of the, Chris mentioned some of these in the automatic enrolment review. Now, the current rules of automatic enrolment do essentially inhibit women from joining, because you've got the 10,000 earnings trigger, so with part-time women aren't included. Now, one of the things we really advocate for is the either the lowering or removal of the earnings trigger, that 10,000 trigger. If it was reduced to the lower earnings limit, for instance, DWP modelling showed, an extra 1.2 million people would be brought in the scope of automatic enrolment, with the vast majority of those being women. And it's a few years old now, but I think this research still holds true in terms of that women are far more likely to earn less than 10,000 a year and be excluded from automatic enrolment. The PPI did some research to show that 32% of female employees do not qualify for automatic enrolment compared to 16% of men. So in terms of solutions, end on a positive, what can be done? I think the biggest thing is for the government to acknowledge this is an issue and actually report on the gender pension gap themselves. I don't mind doing it, and Prospect will continue to do it, but if they did it, I think it's better. If they do it, then they have to have an action plan for tackling it. Reform of automatic enrolment will go a long way to helping solve the problem. And also changes to the tax system, small things relatively speaking, to solve the net pay issue. I know there was a recent call for evidence on that, and hopefully we'll see some movement soon. And a couple of other things like better recognition of caring responsibilities, because generally women who take on the bulk of that, and so out of paid employment and potentially paying into a scheme, and more affordable childcare, so that if women do want to go back into employment, they can do so and then can pay into a pension scheme. Okay, that is me. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that very clear and compelling presentation, setting out the groups who really aren't being served too well by automatic enrolment. Just before we hand over to Cara, we've had a comment come in which is pertinent to your presentation, Joe. It's from Sheila. She said that supply teachers working via agency, she's pointing them out, their role are severely disadvantaged by not being allowed in the teachers' pension scheme. Women make up 76% of the workforce. So that's a very pertinent comment from Sheila there. Thank you very much, which we might pick up after we're finished. But I'd like to hand over now to Cara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. So what I'm going to be presenting today is based on a piece of work that we at the Resolution Foundation published back in January in association with the Living Wage Foundation and funded by Aviva. And this was looking at building a methodology to look at how you could develop the concept of something like a living pension in line with, obviously, I'm sure you'll all be very aware of the living wage. So a lot of this is looking at how that methodology would be built rather than necessarily the big kind of policy questions around how something, a kite mark scheme like that could be implemented. I'll maybe touch on that a bit later. What I think is also going to be quite relevant to these discussions is a lot of the background to that report was looking at the starting point of where employees in the bottom half of the income distribution are already from a starting point in terms of pension saving, despite auto-enrolment. So I think hopefully that will be useful to discussions as well. So as you can see on this first slide, obviously, as kind of Chris and Joe have already set out, it's been some big changes in terms of pensions landscape, most notably through auto-enrolment. And I think the next slide obviously shows this rollout and the boosting of pension saving. Skimming past that, I think Chris and Joe have brilliantly set out a lot of the bigger issues with auto-enrolment so far. We started out by looking at pension savings across distribution, so by age cohort here. I think what we quite quickly realised is that looking at averages here or looking at the mean values, the picture is generally quite positive, right? You're seeing these kind of, some cases, 6-figure sums for mean pension wealth. What you actually show on the next slide is that when we looked instead at kind of median values, at more typical kind of levels of pension saving, those figures are significantly lower. So what you are seeing, if you're looking at just averages, is a real skew of kind of high pension savings. And actually, if we look at this is across the income distribution. So from one of the lowest earners up to 10, the top decile of earners, you're really seeing, if you're actually looking at the typical pension saver, you're looking at people with very, very little, if any, pension wealth towards the bottom end of the distribution. The next slide, you've got a sneak preview there, is if you then strip out people who have defined benefit pension wealth, those values shift even lower. So that's from the dots, so people are just the typical pension wealth, including defined benefit pension wealth. If you then exclude people who have a certain amount of defined benefit wealth, those values shift even lower. And you can see really there that employees in the bottom half of the income distribution, we're seeing very little pension saving there. Moving on to the next slide, again, this I think speaks to a lot of things that we've already heard, which is in terms of eligibility, we're seeing people in the bottom half of the income distribution are a lot less likely to have any pension wealth at all through reporting any kind of pension savings, and less than half in the lowest decile of the income distribution. It's worth saying, so this is from the Wealth and Assets Survey, this data. If you look back over, those are published in waves. The most recent one is 2016 to 2018. But if we look at the past 3 waves of that survey, you can actually see the impact auto-enrolment has been having. So 2012 to 2014, this light pink line at the bottom, you can see up to sort of 75% of people in the bottom income distribution had no pension savings. If you then move into the next wave, 2014 to 16, you can see that that shifts down to sort of just over half of people are saying they have no pension saving. And then you get across that kind of median of the bottom half by the most recent wave, 2016 to 2018. So we'd expect in any subsequent or more recent waves, we'd see that effect continuing and auto-enrolment continuing to boost savings in this bottom half of the income distribution and excluding people who don't have significant defined benefit pension wealth, which is kind of, as an organisation, people we're generally concerned about, so we're focusing on in this project. So I think that was our kind of background, was that a lot of people who we're most concerned about as an organisation and who we'd hope to benefit from any kind of kite mark scheme are people who, from a starting point, have very low, if any, pension saving, but you're beginning to see the effects of auto-enrolment for that group. Looking more broadly at what a living pension could look like and what that concept could look like, we see it as something that could be an employer-facing benchmark. I think here clarity is very important, helping individuals to understand what they need to save for retirement, and taking on really, I guess, a lot of the concepts underlying the living wage in terms of an adequate income, and adequate earnings kind of in the present, and transplanting those into looking at adequate incomes in retirement, adequate living standards in retirement. Obviously, it's a very complex process to work that out. Got a flow chart, I think, on the next slide. If you're talking about the living wage, we base that on the minimum income standard. I think if you're looking at projecting that forward to retirement, you need to look at what that kind of income standard, what adequate standard of living looks like in retirement. You then need to translate that into what pot of savings you'd need to achieve that over your retirement. What you then need to do is look at earnings trajectories and how those differ by gender and by qualification level, to look at what you'd need to be contributing finally to reach that pension pot that would guarantee an adequate standard of living in retirement. Obviously, it's a huge amount of assumptions go into a calculation like this, and if that's something people are interested in, I'd direct you to look at the report, which is on our website. I think on the next slide, yep, so I think simplifying down some of these assumptions, looking at what we think people would need to reach an adequate level of income in retirement. We take again the minimum income standard, which is underlying the living wage calculation. On top of that, we think it's really important that tenure changes are something that we know is happening. We know that more people are staying private renters for longer. The assumptions in the minimum income standard assume that high proportions of retired people, retired single and couple households are homeowners. We think that's going to be far less likely to be true in the future, and therefore we need to factor in kind of the higher costs of pensioners living in the private rental sector if we're thinking about adequate living standards in retirement. So that's what kind of pushes up these pension pots that you can see in this chart, these red and green bars. So obviously there are other factors that feed into this calculation. So the amount of time people have until they reach retirement, obviously somebody in their 20s is a lot longer to build up those savings than somebody currently in their 40s. Obviously earnings trajectories, again, as I said, like if you're somebody who's taking time out or is moving to self-employment, as we've heard in previous presentations, that's something that we know means people end up saving less. And then also more technical questions around the types of pension products, pension savings, pension schemes that are being paid into and how they're then accessed in retirement. But altogether, taking those together, the calculations we came to were that actually a lot of the people in the group we were looking at would need to be contributing far higher than the current rate of auto-enrolment to reach these adequate living standards. So an average of 8.1% additional to auto-enrolment minimum, which for somebody working on an annual basis, for somebody working full-time living wage would be around about £1,500. And obviously this varies significantly by cohort age. As I mentioned at the start, this is very much a sort of jumping off point. This is a methodology you could use to work out a kind of living pension based on the same kind of ideas as a living wage. There's obviously big policy questions around who would be doing these increased contributions, whether this is coming from employee, employer, whether there's a government role in this. And that's something that I think the Living Wage Foundation is going to be taking forward in future. I hope this has been interesting, and some of this context is also helpful to discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cara. And that was a really important piece of research and analysis, which sort of demonstrates yet again that people aren't saving nearly enough if they want to be comfortable in retirement. We've got about 8 questions that have come through, so I'm just going to kick off on those. One, before I do, I'd like to put something just very quickly to the panel, and that's just about the under 10,000 earners question, the issue. It is often said and stated that the people earning less than £10,000 shouldn't be brought into automatic enrolment because perhaps they're better off saving individually into a bank account, or perhaps they couldn't afford it. I just wanted to ask each of you whether that argument held any truck with you, or whether that 10,000 threshold should be removed to bring more people into pensions. If I can start with you, Joe, because it was something that you picked up in your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it should be removed. One of the main reasons for that is that a lot of people have more than one part-time job. And so generally that's women as well. And so there'll be a lot of people with more than one part-time job. Neither of those jobs have earnings of over £10,000, and so that person will not be enrolled. Now, they could be earning £30,000–40,000 a year in theory, but just not being auto-enrolled because the current system isn't really fit for purpose for that. I kind of absolutely believe that there should be choice. If people want to choose a different vehicle of saving for retirement, absolutely. But yeah, definitely, I think that earnings trigger should either be removed entirely or reduced.
Cara, do you have a view on the £10,000 earnings trigger?
I think Joe's really summarised a lot of the arguments that we've kind of talked about in the past. I think another kind of point that's maybe additional to this is that where we have done work as well looking at kind of labour market enforcement and labour market violations around auto-enrolment, and we find that lower income workers are far less likely to be actually receiving the pension, even if they are kind of eligible for auto-enrolment. Or being underpaid. And I think actually, I think some of our work was suggesting that actually if you do push down that threshold, it becomes even more important that you're enforcing that labour market enforcement becomes even more important.
Thank you, Cara. Chris, what are your views?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and it was something that was considered by the 2017 review, but was actually outside of the scope because there's an annual review of this threshold every year. And there's, as I said, there's a balance. So I think Joe's definitely right. There are people who could be automatically enrolled safely, earning less than £10,000. Potentially, they have multiple jobs. They might have partners that have higher paid jobs. And of course, there's always the option for them to opt in doing that. But we know that very few people actually do choose to opt in. The danger, I guess, of lowering that threshold is you then do start to automatically enroll people who maybe can't afford the contributions that that requires from them from their pay packet, or who potentially might not benefit from having that income in retirement, potentially as a result of means testing, for example. But we know that the introduction of the new state pension and the flat rate and the reduction in means testing is making that a relatively smaller group. So I think on balance, and given that people have the option to opt out if they cannot afford to make the contributions, but they would still benefit, or they could benefit if they do make those contributions from the employer contribution as well. And there's an opportunity for them to kind of build up right the way through their working lives. That it's something that you need to look at very closely, and I'd hope it would continue to be looked at every year. The one argument we did have is that potentially, because people in that group may have been automatically enrolled before, we may at some point in the future, as it becomes much more normal for people to save in workplace pensions, an increase in the number of people opting in at that stage. But I think that's going to be a long time before automatic enrolment is well enough embedded and workplace pension is well enough embedded in people's mindsets that it's something they start to look at actively. It's something that we've never really had in the UK before.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Question from Sandra here. She asks, given that occupational pensions mirror inequalities in the labour market and the division of paid and unpaid labour, does it still make sense to build retirement income predominantly on paid labour? So that's sort of addressing a question more to do with those who are taking gaps or aren't in work, women, etc., taking breaks. So if you could just sort of briefly address that question from Sandra, if I could start with you, Cara.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. When we're looking at earnings trajectories and that kind of part of the methodology and looking at how people build pension savings over a lifetime, it is really striking to see how those trajectories tend to differ predominantly by gender when people take time out of the labour market. I don't think I have any particularly great answers. I'm sure Joe and Chris have some really great insight here. But yeah, that's definitely a really striking kind of part of the landscape in terms of pension savings.
Joe or Chris, did you have any comments on that question?
Yeah, I can come in. I think it's interesting. This is one of the ones where you need to look at what you do with occupational pensions alongside the state pension, because obviously the state pension does overcome some of those deficiencies and gaps that you see in the labour market. But if you have a much higher, stronger occupational system, then that undermines the effect that the state pension system has in trying to close that gap. One of the things which I think Joe may come on to, but which we also looked at for now pensions is the idea of a carer's pension, or something where the government pays a top up to those who are making a contribution to society that's unpaid, as a way of trying to overcome some of this. Obviously, that does help people with those gaps, and it helps them to increase their income in retirement. But of course, it comes at a cost. And I think some of the figures we were looking at were suggesting in the region of £2 billion a year of government money to go into it. So it's a balance that you need to look at.
Thanks, Chris. I can see you nodding your head there, Joe. Did you have anything further to add to what Chris has said?
Yeah, so really good points. I kind of think ultimately the current occupational pension system is linked to employment. And I think while you've still got a significant gender pay gap, you're always going to have a significant gender pension gap. And so they kind of work hand in hand. And so you need to look at reducing both. And as Chris said, in terms of the carers top up, there is a significant group of people who just don't have the opportunity to pay into an occupational pension scheme because they are taking on caring responsibilities. And I think, we suggest a carers allowance as one option how to solve that. But again, I think it's similar to the self-employed, that a solution needs to be found for that. It needs to be kind of taken out that too hard to deal with box and actually looked into.
Thank you. Now, this is a very interesting question. Should the minimum pension contribution for employers be higher for low paid workers? Who would like to have a go at that? I'm going to pick on you, Chris.
Thanks. I thought you might. I don't know whether it should be higher for low-paid workers, but I think there is an argument that it should be higher for all workers. And I think in particular, when we're thinking about if there is going to be an increase in minimum contributions at some point in the future, obviously post-COVID and recovery from those kind of places, it would make much more sense to put any increase in contributions on the employer contribution than the employee contribution. And the reason for that is not necessarily because it's any more affordable for employers than it is for employees, because ultimately the economist in me says that the money all comes from the same place anyway. And if there's higher pension contributions from employers, there'll be lower pay settlements in the future. So it's just the same money, but being directed in a different way. But it does make a really big difference when you look at the incentives for people to stay in a pension or to opt out. So if you have a high employer contribution and a lower employee contribution, then you're giving up a lot of money if you decide not to save in a pension. Whereas if there's a much bigger employee contribution, there's a much bigger incentive to opt out because you get more money back into your pay packet. So I think the way in which you set up these structures and that split between employer and employee contributions is really important in determining the overall outcome, even if superficially it looks like it's just the same money going in the same way.
Cara and Joe, do you think that there is a case for changing the construction of contributions for groups such as the low paid, or even for the young, if the automatic enrolment eligibility threshold is going to lower to 18, and these younger people find it more difficult to save? Is there a case for asking the employer to pay a higher amount for them potentially, or for the young, or even for the low paid? Do you agree?
I think from our side, I think Chris really brilliantly set out the real difficulties in kind of the interrelation of factors between employee and employer contributions. I think it's interesting you bring up the young. I think also there's a question about those people who are kind of closer to retirement, who already have very low levels of pension savings, and what the answer is for them. Because I think they're a group that we find particularly difficult when we're thinking about a living pension, is that there are groups who have perhaps been low earners throughout their life, or very low levels of pension saving. But if you're, say, in your 50s, it's quite unlikely that high contributions at this point are going to catch you up on what the solution is for those groups. I think your more kind of broader question about higher employer contributions, I'm going to slightly dodge and say it's something that we've come out with figures saying that there's bigger chunks of population who need to be contributing or need to have higher pension saving. It's something we're hoping to work on in the future, is how exactly you do that, how you deal with all the kind of the policy difficulties that Chris has just set out.
Joe, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just I'm not sure. I really agree with Chris. I think that I'm not sure about separating different segments of society, maybe in terms of different contribution levels. I kind of feel that overall there just needs to be a real rebalancing of the contribution levels between employees and employers. When you look at historically, and we've still got many members in DB schemes, and they really benefit the pension they're getting, and part of that they know is because the employer contributes significantly to it. And even for newer defined contribution schemes where we've managed to negotiate, really good employer contributions, that is a real incentive for people to join the scheme. And when you talk to young members, what they do see is that, okay, if I opt out, then I'm kind of losing free money from my employer here. So that's a real reason to stay in a pension scheme. But when we looked at the pension adequacy in terms of the contribution levels, and there needs to be an overall increase, because the current levels, if people stick at 8% for their career, it's very unlikely they'll have enough to have a comfortable retirement. So I agree with Chris. I think overall the whole levels need looking at.
Thank you. Question here, quick, sharp one. Will collective, or can collective defined contribution schemes be a solution to some of the problems that have been mentioned? I guess those problems are chiefly women and the self-employed, participation rates, and the adequacy issue. One of the problems that our system doesn't address at the moment very well is the longevity issue. So as women do live longer than men generally, potentially could CDC offer women the chance of a better outcome than they could get in individual DC under automatic enrolment? I'll throw that one at you, Joe, just to start.
Yeah, so I think CDC is a really promising area, and it definitely has the potential to provide better outcomes for members. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how Royal Mail gets on setting up their scheme. Now, I think the massive issue is that people go through their entire career sometimes, especially in the DC field, and doing nothing with their pension as such as, default investment strategy. And then you get to retirement. Now annuities, the rates are so poor that, a lot of people don't see value in them. People are looking at drawdown, but then you're asking someone to manage, hopefully, pension pots in six figures, and they've never had to make a financial decision with, £200,000. And suddenly you're throwing all this money at people and telling them to make that last for their retirement. Whereas CDC has the potential to give that kind of more secure, regular income for people. And yeah, absolutely. In answer to the question, yes, I think it really could improve the outcomes for all people, but especially women. Yeah.
Cara or Chris, did you want to come in on that question?
I think just agree with Joe's point there in terms of sort of transfers of risk there. I think, yeah, from our kind of looking at focusing mainly on kind of private pension contributions as a way of getting people to build adequate savings. Obviously, that's not the only solution, and actually a way of doing that I think a lot of the concept behind a kind of kite mark scheme is to kind of improve that clarity and improve people's understandings of their pension saving. But obviously there are other ways of doing that are perhaps reduce that kind of risk and that the onus on the kind of individual saver even further. I think those are really important avenues to look at.
Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, it's an area that we've done quite a bit of work on at the Pensions Policy Institute. I think two things worth pointing out. If you can invest collectively when you're building up, and a lot of people are in default funds, as Joe was saying, that then you could actually have probably a slightly more, not quite sure what the right word, but more long-term investment strategy involved in that, and without the need to be de-risking towards the end of your career if you're still in a collective pool. So that can actually boost the amount of return that you get over your lifetime for the amount of contributions that are put in. But I think probably the bigger point is, as Joe said, automatic enrolment is just purely focused on getting people to have money at retirement. We are still, after the freedom of choice reforms from 2014, 2015, at a kind of an evolving stage of what people will be able to do with that money, and collective DC in the decumulation space, I think, has the potential to kind of I would say try and replace annuitization as a way of trying to manage longevity risk as people go through. So it's not possible currently in the UK to have that. I think the legislation is only purely in the accumulation phase to help Royal Mail, but it's something that I think will be worth investigating further.
Thanks, Chris. We're getting a lot of questions coming through on adequacy and on contributions and how to increase them. And of course, as of today, we do not have a roadmap to get beyond 8%. And we only have an ambition to increase the participation of automatic enrolment by the mid-2020s. Now, given we've just had a pandemic, the country has spent hundreds of billions of pounds, so the outlook is going to be particularly difficult economically. I'm interested in the panel's views on how we can move forward with these changes to automatic enrolment, which were recommended in 2017. Should they be done all at once, or should we look at doing things individually, say, for example, removing the lower earnings threshold? What path can a path be drawn to improve participation in automatic enrolment when we're going through such difficult financial circumstances? I'll put that one to you, Joe, to start.
Yeah, I think there is a way to do it. I think the introduction of automatic enrolment, what really helped with the success of it was the phased introduction of the contribution rates, because they started off from a really low level. I imagine the theory behind it, people almost won't quite notice, the contributions coming out, they don't opt out, and the contributions go up, and there's that apathy towards pensions quite often, which I think has worked really well here because people have left it alone, they've stayed in schemes. It's been really good. And I think that's probably how to take it forward. Now, kind of picking on the contribution levels, because, in terms of timelines, I think if you were, like I said, I feel they should be really balanced between employees and employers. And so if, for instance, you work towards a 6% employee, 6% employer contribution rate, that's a small increase for members. And you can phase in over time that increase for employers, because I understand, you know, there's financial pressures in paying that extra amount. This minute probably isn't the best time to do that, but I think in the next few years it should be slowly phased in and get those contribution levels up.
Thank you. Cara?
I think I'd agree there with Joe that because we faced kind of the massive hit of the pandemic, isn't a reason to stall completely progress in this area. But right now, in a time that's particularly challenging for living standards in the present, it could be difficult in the very short term. But post that kind of immediate hit of the crisis, I think obviously progress is still going to be incredibly important.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, similar thoughts, I think, but a couple of things to point out. One is, I guess we're still not entirely sure what the impact of COVID and the pandemic will be. And it may be that we need a plan to rebuild back to the minimum levels that we had before as a result of coming out of this. So it's important that we do that. But longer term, undoubtedly, the fundamentals aren't going to change. The state pension is not going to carry on being triple locked forever. There will at some point be an increased reliance on private pensions going forward. And that means that many people will need to contribute more than the minimum. The review recommendations, in particular, removing that lower earnings limit does have the same impact as increasing contributions, and that's a good way of starting it off. But I think it's really important that we do start thinking and planning for it now, because as Joe said, the reason that automatic enrolment has worked so well is because it was introduced over a long period of time. It wasn't a big step change at any one point in time. It was gradually introduced. And so it's going to take time for us to get there. And the longer we leave it, the longer it's going to take for us to actually get going. So even if we start thinking about it now, it's going to be 5-6 years before anything's implemented. So I don't think we've got that much time to lose.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes to go. So if you could, I've got pull in one more question. If you could give us a quick answer to this, it's fairly straightforward, but an interesting one. Should there be a legal requirement on employers to train employees to understand their pension scheme? Joe?
So I'm a bit uneasy, I suppose, about making things like mandatory. But what I would say is, prior to working at Prospect, I've worked for various employers. And what you really do see a benefit from is sitting down and talking to employees about their pension, because quite often they come and see you maybe only 5 years before retirement and know nothing about pensions. And you can see the actual value from that and the value they get when they kind of leave the room and they get a grasp of what it is they understand. I think the focus should maybe be on tapping into kind of younger people and their understanding of pensions, because I think if you build an understanding of pensions at kind of younger age groups, then that will really help to build better outcomes for those members going forward. So I'm not sure about mandatory, but I would just kind of absolutely think there should be a focus on education in pensions.
Yeah, an interesting facet of the workplace situation is that even people who are earning less than £10,000 can opt into a pension scheme and benefit from an employer contribution above the lower earnings amount, but that is very rarely done because people don't know about it. So I think there is absolutely a lot of work to do on that side to make people aware of opting in until there is a requirement. But Cara or Chris, did you want to come in on employers taking a bigger role perhaps in educating employees about the benefits of pensions?
I think that's definitely something that's really underlined a lot of the work we're doing on living pension or on a kind of kite marking scheme, is this idea that a lot of people just don't have much of an idea about the pension saving that they're doing and what that's going to get them in retirement. I think whether that comes through employers kind of mandatory training for employees, I guess I think it would be great if employees had kind of better understanding of their pensions. But then I guess the other side of it is also that I think there should be really a kind of an onus on the employers, given the kind of real complexity of pension saving. And as I think going through the kind of some of the calculation of my presentation, the amount of kind of assumptions you need to understand what that's actually going to look like in retirement. I think maybe something that puts the focus more on the employers to say, here's a recognisable standard and I'm meeting it, might be a better option than kind of trying to put that onus again on the employee and saying you should understand what this is going to look like for your retirement, when actually the complexity of that is really considerable.
Briefly, Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I would see it as a role rather than a requirement. There's definitely scope for employers to do more, but there's also scope for many other things to be done as well. Pensions dashboards are part of that, the role of the Money and Pension Service, the role of government. And I think before we can get understanding of pensions up, we need to get awareness of pensions up. So I think there's a number of stepping stones we'll need to do. And if we can get people aware of what they're saving first, then hopefully understanding will follow.
Thank you very much. And it is about 1:02, so I've got about 40 seconds to wrap up. That's just flown by. Thank you very much to Chris, Cara and Joe for those excellent, compelling and very clear presentations today. I've learned a lot from you all, and I hope the discussion has been interesting for the audience as well too. And thank you for your participation. I think there was over 150 people. We've got a long queue of questions still, so there's still lots of interest in this topic. On Thursday, there will be a discussion on the state pension, during which I think there will be some pickup on the issues to do with automatic enrolment and adequacy. So do look out for that session at 1 o'clock on Thursday, and there is also one tomorrow on CDC, which we discussed today. So with that, that's all for me and all for us. Thank you all and have a good afternoon. Thank you.